Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the first of 3 roundtables on Henry's new book, Comics and Stuff. We have a wonderful roundtable today. The next 2 take place on Tuesdays, so take a look at his blog. Hopefully we can maybe share it in the chat in case you want to RSVP for one of the next 2 sessions. I'll start by introducing our panel today, and forgive me, I'm looking at my phone so that I'm not screen sharing. First off, we have our host of the hour, Henry Jenkins, Provost Professor of Communication, Journalism, Cinematic Art, and Education at USC. He's the author and editor of 20 books on various aspects of media and popular culture. Among them are Textual Poachers, Television Fans and Participatory Culture, Convergence Culture, Where Old Media and New Media Collide, Popular Culture and the Civic Imagination, Case Studies of Creative Social Change, and Comics and Stuff. I'm your moderator, Drew Morton. I'm an associate professor at Texas A&M University in Texarkana. I wrote a book called Panel to the Screen. Up next, we have our audience chair, Billy Proctor, principal lecturer in comics, film, and transmedia at Bournemouth University. He's the co-editor of the books Transmedia Earth, Global Convergence Cultures, and the award-winning Disney's Star Wars Forces of Production, Promotion, and Reception with Richard McCullough. Billy is a leading expert on the history and theory of reboots and is currently preparing his debut monograph on the topic for publication, Reboot Culture, Comics, Film, and Transmedia at Palgrave Macmillan. He has also published widely on a broad array of subjects, including Batman, James Bond, Stephen King, Star Trek, Star Wars, and other forms of popular culture. He is co-editor of the forthcoming edited collection, Horror Franchise Cinema, and associate editor of the website Confessions of an ACA Fan. Our panelists for today, Nick Sousanis is the Eisner-winning comics author and associate professor in humanities and liberal studies at San Francisco State University, where he runs an interdisciplinary comic studies program. He's the author of Unflattening, originally his doctoral dissertation, which he wrote and drew entirely in comics form. Published by Harvard University Press in 2015, Unflattening received the 2016 American Publishers Association Humanities Award for Scholarly Excellence and the 2016 Lind Ward Prize for Best Graphic Novel. Nick's comics have appeared in Nature, the Boston Globe, and Columbia Magazine. Lisa Pons is a historian of European art, architecture, and material culture made between the 15th and 17th centuries, and professor of art history at USC. Her research and teaching focus on the mobilities of art, artistic authority, and collaboration, and the Renaissance concept of copia or abundance. Her most recent book, Printed Icon, examines an early print on paper that did not burn in a fire in 1428 and the consequences of that survival. And finally, Will Straw. Will Straw is James McGill Professor of Urban Media Studies at McGill University in Montreal. His interests include magazine history, theories of collecting, and the cultures of the urban night. So thank you all for joining us. To our audience, if you have questions throughout the conversation, please put them in the chat, and Billy will be filtering them out, and we'll leave the last 20 minutes or so for audience questions. My first question is, what are comics to you? How do you define that? You can choose to do that in terms of form, in terms of industry, in terms of aesthetics, kind of whatever grasps you.
Well, I guess expectation is I'll start then. It's actually, having written a book on it, it gets harder and harder to define what we mean by comics the more you look at it. Since I'm making the case that it's not necessarily a sequential art, the juxtaposition within a single frame can be a really important part of it. And so that I don't necessarily accept Scott McCloud's sequential art definition. It clearly, and it also isn't necessarily words and images juxtaposed, which is something I fall back on rather a lot in the book, where I cite a variety of examples of forms that we probably don't intuitively think of as comics that involve the juxtapositions of words and images. And the more we strip that away and go to pictorial storytelling, the more we include other things that we probably intuitively don't think are comics. So I think the definition of comics remains in crisis for me. I don't know that I can give you a simple, direct definition, except we know it when we see it. There certainly are traditions like cartooning that are sort of cohesive over time that we could look at. But I think as we move beyond that to the radical experimentation of style that's going on right now, it becomes harder and harder to pinpoint when does comics bleed over, say, into artist books, which would be another category of stuff that involve graphics and words in some cases and other things, and might include the same range of styles as some of the more experimental comics we're looking at today. And I had this discussion with David Mack about his work, which I think he argues is deeply influenced by artist books and the ways he conceptualizes what it is he creates, even when he's working for Daredevil and Marvel.
Yeah, I was a little concerned when I was going to ask this question that it was going to suck up all the oxygen in the room, because comic studies folks love to argue over the definition of comics. What about you, Nick?
Sure. I mean, I think every single creator and scholar of comics you ask will give you a different definition of what comics are. And I think, they're often very reflective of their own practice of comics making. I think, what I put forth in in Unflattening is a lot about what you can do with comics. And I think Henry already commented on it, the idea that yes, they are read like text, but they're also the fact that we view them as an image allows this other sort of interactions, both connections across the page and across the entire work. So I really feel that the static and flatness of a comic, the static and flatness of a comic's page allows for these sort of, allows you to go at your own pace, and it allows for you to make the sort of different kinds of connections across ideas and across images that goes way beyond, putting an image next to a text or an image next to an image. It allows this sort of connectedness that I think mirrors a little bit how our thoughts work. So I don't think that's a definition. I think I'm much more interested in what I can do with them and what they can do. And when I think about my own program in comics, I'm really, I get, it's not a making program. We have lots of making. It's a studies, which is sort of founded in making, but the range of skills people come with, some are drawers, some have never touched drawing since they were like 6. So it's all like, how can we figure out how you can get your ideas together and use this form the best way you can? And some people are going to be very wordy and have some pictures. Some people are very and some are going to be very experimental because they happen to have me as a teacher. So that tends to happen more often than not. But that's what I got. Thanks.
If I could just jump on after that, I am clearly the odd duck here. I'm clearly the one that's coming from really a different angle. And I'm finding it so intriguing to hear you talking about what comics are in terms of your object of study, because I feel like it parallels our discussions of what art is, or what material culture is, or what visual culture is, or what digital humanities is, and how we might define it being really tied to our own personal interrogations of how we want to practice our work. I think I'm here because I, for a long time, have been really interested in works on paper from the 16th century, and thinking about paper as a medium for communication, both in text and in images. I think I reached out to Henry because one of my great joys in coming to USC was this chance to think broadly with wonderful interlocutors. Like, there's no one thinking with me here in the School of Athens, but I have all of you at USC and all of you here virtually now to think with about the question of what I was calling, from the period vocabulary of my time, the cartoon, or the cartone, the big piece of paper, which is the last preparatory drawing, the same scale as the finished work, which when you're doing a fresco is massive. So they called it big paper. And I had organized a conference called Big Paper, Large Design in the Renaissance that was supposed to take place in April, in which I'm hoping will reformat into various other ways. Big paper in small pieces, I'm calling it now, in the coming year. So I approached Henry with this question of how can we think about designs that are made in a one-to-one scale to the finished product, And I kept saying cartoon, and he said to me, comics. I was like, oh, sorry, comics. But I'm actually really intrigued to hear this discussion, and I'd really like to hear more from those of you who work within it to hear your definitions as well.
If I could just jump in, I'm not really a comic scholar either. I mean, it is interesting. This is the question, of course, film studies stopped asking, what is cinema? Either because they couldn't answer it or because someone said, well, how about we ask the question, where is cinema? I don't know if where is comics has the same kind of sense of resolving things, but you know, I just joined, maybe some of you are on the Facebook group, Platinum Era Comics. That's the whole debate over when do comics first appear. It's just, you know, the question is so exploded now that it's irresolvable, I think.
Well, that brings me to the second question, which is, Henry begins his book by kind of describing this Faustian bargain that Art Spiegelman describes, where comics go from being this kind of disposable object. One time I saw Art Spiegelman do a talk, and he said something along the lines of, those are what you wrapped your fish guts in on Sunday night, and you threw them away the next day, right? You didn't keep them. They were designed to be disposed of, to something much more reputable and high in our cultural kind of pantheon of being graphic novels, right? I'm curious when each of you started to think about comics as something that was a material object.
Oh, as a kid, right? When you started, I'm sorry, may I speak? As a kid, when you started collecting them, when all the geeks in your neighborhood collected them and they suddenly had value in the neighborhood, right? That's when they had value.
Yeah, I grabbed off my shelf one of the earliest comics that I ever read, which is a Dennis the Menace comic. You know, this was one that ended up at the lake house. My friends read it, you know, with dirty fingers. It's got rips in it, pages are missing. Obviously, the cover is gone. And squirrels made nests with them, right, at a certain point. And so this content now turns into this, which is not the most upscale of graphic novels, but it is hardbound. It's intended to, this copy I bought from secondhand from a library. So it originally was on a library shelf, this version of that exact same content. The striking thing is the artist names and the writer's names are now on the cover of this, whereas this version of it only mentions Hank Ketchum, who farmed this work out to someone else to do the graphic novel. And Ketchum's work is now in this form, which is hardbound with a bookmark inside it, part of a series of comics that are being reprinted these days. So the shift from the stuff I read that was completely ripped apart and meant to be ripped apart by a cabin full of boys on a rainy Sunday afternoon to these editions which are meant to be prestige and preserved and protected is part of what led me to be interested in this question of the materiality of comics and how that shifts our awareness of what this medium might be. But the fact that I still have some of the first comics that I ever read.
What year was that from, Henry?
That would have been early 60s. I don't think the title page is there for me to get a copyright date, but it's probably 64, 65 maybe.
It's interesting that the Dennis the Menace character was in the Beano in the UK in 1938. So
well, like different character. I discovered that when I was in the UK. And there was a copyright battle between the two authors sometime in the 60s over that title, but totally different character.
Got you.
I mean,
anybody else? Go ahead.
You know, when I was 11 or 12, two friends of my parents, who we called aunt and uncle, brought me two Marvel comics. I'd never read comics. And that changed my life. I mean, I wouldn't be sitting here as a professor if there weren't a whole bunch of mediating steps. But what was interesting about Marvel at this point, and this is the late 60s, is that interpolated you as somebody who was going to hold on to this and was going to go back and get ones from before and keep buying ones that came after and read ones that were coming out at the same time. There was, you know, the built into the very mode of address of those comics was the building of a public and a fandom, which I think was a really significant transformation in how comics spoke to people.
Just to double back off that a little bit, one of my first kind of material comics that I'm a little younger, Superman, and I remember getting it in the black bag, and my dad, who's an antique dealer, was like, you cannot open that book, right? It's in the bag, it's going to be worth something. So it not only spoke to the spectator market that we see in the 80s and 90s, but it was also this book where, like, I never read it. It's still in a bag somewhere. Like, I had to wait and buy the trade paperback to actually find out what the art was, to see it in another format that I actually felt like I could, you know, taint by opening the pages of, which kind of brings us back to this whole idea of now putting these things in these plastic coffins where they wait and wait forever. Nick, did you want to jump in on that, or did you have any thoughts?
I mean, my first experience, I have a much older brother, so you know, I'm who read Batman comics to me, so like Batman's my first word. You know, so I was very into comics from an early age. I mean, the question of thinking about them as an object is that one's a little more confusing to me to think about. I mean, it's just sort of how you learn to read and how you learn to so many things came out of comics. That's been part of my life since, you know, before I can remember. So that, I don't have that sort of later moment. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
It's always already for you. For me, I think it's a little different. I feel like my earliest memories of looking at comic strips in newspapers, I remember my father would bring home from work either the Daily News or the New York Times, and I could not really tell which he would bring or whether there was any pattern, but I knew that they were different. They were also different. They were bigger than things that I would usually read, and the New York Times was enormous to me. And if it were the Daily News, I would go straight to the comics page. And if it were the Daily News, I would really fixate on what I would call now the Gothic fraktur, the headline in that beautiful, and really fixate on looking at how that was made. That was what was of most interest to me. I remember when I was a little older, I also had an older brother who would hand me down things. And so I got some comics that way too. I think that was my first experience of having the books as not quite collectible, but you know, he didn't want it, so I got it. Right? In college, I remember looking at things like Daredevil and just being completely entranced. And now I've reached the next generation. My son gives me things like Saga, and I am again still entranced. So this has been really fun to hear it from your perspective, where you are so deeply immersed.
I want to just throw in, because I think I'm a relative youngster compared to the other people in here, and my first experience with comics was after the Comics Code Authority. So like my first experience with comics was probably in the checkout lane in the grocery store as a kid, begging my mom to get me Archie comics. And so I just think that's kind of interesting. And also because I was exposed to video games before I was exposed to comics. And so as probably like a preteen, that era, so this is probably mid to late 90s, I mostly was interested in comics that were based on the video games that I was playing. So like Sonic the Hedgehog and stuff like that. So I just think it's an interesting counterpoint to the sort of 60s experience versus the 90s experience.
My next question is for Henry. Henry, you begin the book by using Michael Thompson's work on rubbish to kind of provide a framework for thinking through the materiality of comics. Can you walk us through his taxonomy that you use a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this was one of my real finds as I started digging into the materiality debates and writing a material culture elsewhere. It's not a text I've seen cited very much in cultural studies or media studies, but we really should be paying more attention to it. He's an economist of sorts who is trying to think about how value travels. And he starts on one hand with rubbish, which is stuff we just instantly toss without even really thinking about it. So I bought a new DVD, I took the plastic wrap off of it. It's not like I'm gonna hold on to the plastic wrap as a significant item that I'm going to cherish alongside the DVD. You may hold on to the plastic bag with the comic in it, but that's a different proposition. So that's rubbish. Transient is stuff that I may use for a while, and then when I've used it up, I get rid of it. And then durable or enduring materials are things that I'm going to hold on to for an extended period of time. So he's interested not in that as a fixed taxonomy, but how do things travel up and down that spectrum? How does something that should be disposed of turn into something that we should keep? How do we decide as a culture, say, that the toys and stuff of our childhood is something that we hold on to? How did I decide to rescue that Dennis the Menace book from my mother, who would have been tossing all of these other comics away because they were torn apart, but I held on to this piece of tattered colored cloth. And even though I have the same text now in multiple forms and it's more readable in the printed book, that text still has meaning and value to me. So he says that things can fade into obscurity, but there has to be real pressure to move them toward the center where they become enduring texts. And I think that's interesting to think about comics too, where literally the word rubbish gets applied by an awful lot of parents or non-comics readers to what kids are reading when they're reading children's comics. And even a hardcore comics fan may dismiss Dennis the Menace, say, as just a rubbish comic, not a serious comic that we should pay attention to. So this argument over the canon and over Art Spiegelman's Faustian deal, where we trade off some of the vibrancy of popular culture for an enduring status through dominant cultural institutions, that exchange is very much about moving things back and forth on that continuum that Thompson is talking about. And I think we could use it to talk about any number of other media artifacts that we've decided to keep as opposed to dispose of.
That's a great segue into my question for Lisa, which was, I was curious about how the medium of paper-based art has evolved. So you were talking about these sketches that were done for plans for frescoes. Were those ever, when are those seen as artifacts in their own right? When do they evolve that way? When are they something that went from being thrown away or maybe kept in an archive to something that's, you know, preserved and hung up on a wall of like the Getty Institute or something like that?
No, this is actually one of the big questions in my work, and one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by paper. I think that paper as a support for communication comes into widespread use in Western Europe in the 15th century. And it is a big explosion, and one that sort of comes over other types of support, such as parchment, which is animal-based, or textile, which is vegetal-based. I think it's fair to say that before the 15th century, even well into the 15th century, the idea of preparatory drawings as something that was largely private, if not secret, to the studio, to the workshop that was using it, to be reused by those who were making things, to be part of the process, but not really something to be admired aesthetically, certainly not in its own sake, or collected for its aesthetic value. Its use value maybe, because some of these patterns, we might call them, were given to people who would inherit them down chains of artistic genealogy. But I think in the beginning of the 16th century, there's this moment where, first of all, people start drawing a lot more. There's a lot more of what John Sherman called research and development in the making of compositions. So there's lots more drawings, number one. And the response of some of those, some of the draftsmen, was to not let people collect them, to destroy them. And Michelangelo is a famous example. As he's dying, he's like burning his drawings because he doesn't want anyone to see his process. But on the flip side of that, you have people like Raphael, who is making cartoons which are, 12-foot drawings, right? So enormous works on the scale of painting, and actually using new types of media, like instead of dry media, like black chalk and red chalk, he would also use wet media like tempera or opaque paints and watercolors for these cartoons. So they become painterly, they become painting-based, tonal-based, and they become both used, like his cartoons for the tapestries for the Pope in the Sistine Chapel get cut into strips regularly so that they can be woven into tapestries. But some of them get put back together and brought back to Italy for collectors who displayed them. So there's this flip right in the 16th century where an object that had been purely part of the process becomes something valued for its own sake. And that transition is one that I'm really fascinated by.
Thank you. I'm going to go a little out of order on the planned questions. I think this starts to hint at what I wanted to ask Nick, which is, and I'll bring up the screen share in a minute, I'm curious about what you do with your drafts and your sketches and your alternatives and revisions as a scholar and a practitioner. Do you keep those? Do you think that it's important to make them available as a sort of mentor text? What has been your kind of approach on that? I'll share screen and bring up one of your sketches in just a moment.
Sure, and I got a bunch of them up if you need me to, but yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, this is the first roadmap to the book, which was really important for me to reproduce it in the printed version of Unflattening. I actually wanted quite a bit more. I think it's interesting to me. Like, I think part of what I talk about when I share this is it's, like this has Easter eggs. Like you can see things I did and things I didn't do as the work evolved. But I think two other things it really points out is one, how sort of badly I draw and how intentionally badly I draw. And the better I get at this, the more I try to draw badly. In that drawing badly allows me to see new things in the work and allows me to, the sort of looseness of the sketches allows me to see more. So I think showing this, I've been showing these in talks for years now, that people can kind of see that, if you see the finished work, you think, oh my God, that took 8 million hours and I can never do that. But if you see this, you can say, well, I can scribble on a piece of paper and make notes to myself. That looks kind of like what I do already. So I think it's important to see for that reason. And it's one reason I share a lot of it. And I think it's also important because this is where the work comes from. I get this question a lot, do you think of the words first or the pictures? And I say, yes. Because it's this dynamic of making these sketches and doing iterations of them, and it's really only in the dialogue with my sketch, using my visual system to keep like seeing what I see in these drawings I made, that I learn where I'm headed. And I think I like to share them. I post tons on my website. The book reproduced a fair amount of them. I don't know exactly where I want to end with this, but I think even for myself, my next book, which I'm in the middle of, I'm planning to incorporate more of them directly in the work, which I haven't yet figured out how. But I think I spent a long time stuck on where I was going with it. I'd done all this research and I was like all excited about all these ideas, but it really felt very flat. It felt like these are a lot of good ideas, but this is not my book. And it's not until so I make my sketches in two ways. I have these large, super cheap newsprint, and then I have notebooks where I like work out compositions, but the super cheap newsprint is large so I can see what I'm doing. And the cheapness is important because I don't care if it's not, now this becomes an issue for preservation because they're rotting as I'm making them. And I kind of am attached to keeping them, but scanners are good. But it wasn't, so I'm stuck. And then I finally said, look, you're trying to talk about the importance of drawing as a way of thinking. Get your stupid sketches out and start going. And as soon as you start making these marks and making these movements, it really taught me a lot about where I wanted to go. So I may be getting far afield from your question, but I think it is really important to see these works. And to me, it's often, as somebody who goes to art exhibits and things, I'm often more interested in how the work came to be than I am in the final product. I'm interested to see the sort of the footprints of their thinking. And I think, sharing those sketches is why I do that. So, thanks, Drew.
Thank you. I want to start transitioning to talking about stuff, and I want to lead off with a question for Henry. In the book, you write about that graphic novels have come of age and have come to a point where they, quote, increasingly explore consumer and material culture and nostalgia and historical memory. I'm curious if you think this is unique to just mainstream modes of storytelling like a DC or Marvel, or if it's more intuitive, or if it's more kind of inherent to something like a graphic novel. And when I was reading that section, I couldn't help but think about the difference in two collections, which would be maybe Harvey Picar's record collection and Batman's Batcave. And I'll bring up a comparison in just a moment so we can look at that. But yeah, I'm wondering what's the difference between those two collections? How might we think about those?
Well, I mean, I would start, my argument was that that graphic novels and modeling themselves after novels have taken on some of the mission of the novel, which is to deal often with the everyday life worlds of everyday people and the ways people's social interaction with each other shape each other, right? And that's a central theme in Asterios Polyp that I write about in this section. So as we move toward novels, then writing novels today, invariably consumer culture, material culture, memory enters into that, because we're in this period of time that Will Straw writes about so beautifully. And I have to say, Will, your essay in Residual Media was one of the real starting points for me on this project, where you're describing how old stuff that's been discarded is being revalued online by online communities, and new kinds of historical consciousness and personal memory are emerging around that. So I was seeing that unfolding in these graphic novels. Now, in terms of your question here, I think the differences between personal memory, and Harvey Picar is an interesting example because he writes the story and other artists draw his work. So it's not as seamless as the graphic novelist I write about in the book, who are telling their own stories with their own pens, writing and drawing their own work. So there is a representation there of Picar and his record collection, but the writing itself grows out of his personal connection to it. Whereas Batman's collection, I think they're really, I wrote in the blog interview that I did with Billy and some other people, that Batman is a great example. We could write about Batman as a collector. We're less likely to write about any individual artist as a collector, right? That because that's a mythology that's accrued over time in a corporate product where we don't know who contributed the dinosaur and who contributed the penny and so forth. As comic readers, we recognize that stuff over time, but it is not tied to the consciousness of an individual artist. It's tied to the consciousness of a corporation, the consciousness of an evolving mythology. And I think it'd be interesting to write about, but I don't think you'd write about it in the same language that I use to discuss the graphic novels and comics and stuff. And I don't mean that in a hierarchical sense that one's more valuable than the other, just that functionally, consciousness of artists and fans work differently in response to those materials. So, Will, I don't know if you have more you would like to say about that piece.
Well,
it really does lay a framework for a lot of the work that we're talking about today.
Well, thank you. And it's not, I mean, and I'm not just trying to return a compliment, because what reading your book and in particular the first chapter that we were sort of assigned for this panel, echoed so much with things I'm interested in, which is, as a media theorist, we are being told to think of things, for example, as containers. And so, a panel is a container. I'm interested in scenes in films where you have a whole bunch of extras in the background, each of whom represents a different career from vaudeville or theater. Well, that frame in the film is a kind of container, a museum, an archive of all of these kinds of faces and histories and so on. And so just the way in which every panel in the comic books you talk about, but we could say almost every comic book is a set of objects that together represent very complex histories. I mean, there's things that are a week old, there are things that are 10 years old, and that gives a semiotic complexity to comics, but it's also one of the ways in which knowledge about stuff is captured and moved forward in time and between people and so on. So to me, that part of your book was incredibly kind of productive and stimulating. More so than my incoherent ramble just now might suggest.
No, well, thanks for that.
I was actually going to ask Will, what draws people to collect stuff? Because that's your area of specialty. What is it about individual objects? And I see it's even come up in the chat a little bit. I'm curious about things like price guides and manuals or outside organizations and what kind of value they give to stuff. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, years ago, I wrote an article on gender and collecting records. Now, I wasn't the first person to have found a relationship between the two. But, and so you go and you read all the psychology of collecting, and, it's overcompensation. It's, all of the kind of pop psychological concepts. But it seemed to me there were kind of two. One is the notion of the collection as a private refuge, Batman in his Batcave. The other is the collection as a public monument where you build something that will show to the rest of the world the importance of this. And I think most versions of collecting are in between that. In terms of price guides, I mean, I started as a stamp collector and you had the Scott guides. And then when I was in comics, you had the Overstreet. Now I collect old true crime tabloids from Mexico, France, Canada, and the US. And it's a market that is totally chaotic. There's absolute instability. It's impossible to nail it down with any kind of authoritative list or annotation or guess as to pricing. From the previous discussion about original art, I mean, in Mexico City, in flea markets, I see original art from fotonovelas, where, photographs with word balloons going for almost nothing. Will there ever be a market for those? I'd be fascinated to know that. How would that stabilize? What would be the preconditions for those becoming collectible with all the institutions of value stabilization that are part of collecting cultures? I mean, questions fascinate me.
If I could hop on here, I was really, I'm actually also very interested in collecting and what makes things collectible. I was really struck in reading your chapter, Henry, thinking about your discussions of where these objects came from, that you would look in catalogs, that you would be able to recognize certain elements of 20th century design, for example, or that you would go out looking for particular types of settings to bring into your work. I'm wondering if maybe the work of the artist Rosamund Purcell. She had an exhibition in Tufts the year I first taught for them, which would have been 2004, which I think is when you might have been in Boston too. She had an exhibition called Two Rooms, which I found incredibly fascinating because one was based on a Renaissance Wunderkammer, or cabinet of curiosities, published in a book by the son of Olaus Worms, who was a humanist, and it showed the most incredible things like narwhal horns and strange stones and sculptures and all sorts of things, which she recreated by gathering all these materials and putting into the gallery space, which on its own is already a fantastic artistic gesture. But for me, what made her work just so stupendous was she took an equal volume of gallery space and filled it with a free reconstruction of her own studio in Somerville, where she had brought all this stuff from a junkyard in Maine. She would go to Maine and go to the junkyard and come back with stuff that she thought looked interesting and stuck it in her studio. So it was this juxtaposition of these two recreated spaces, one from long ago and one from literally her own space, next to each other, both filled with this idea of gathering things that are uncanny visually, fields of attraction, we might say, for our looking, and yet in some ways striking on so many themes, like the idea of reproducibility, the idea of the move from rubbish to something that would be encountered in a gallery, the massive accumulation of stuff, and not just in, as you say, the material form, but also in its emotional attachments to these two different spaces. I don't know if you were able to see that exhibition?
I didn't see that one. Around that same time period, I had a grad student who had read Larry Grossberg's essay on mattering maps, where the student surveyed all the other students in the seminar and then reconstructed in a room a space where all the things that mattered to us were, the things we mattered most to us were configured in different ways. And so we could walk through a shared space. and see objects that were symbolically important to each member of the class. And there were various configurations of them that helped us see our connections to each other. And that left a very strong, imprint on me. But yeah, I'm very interested in the fact that the stuff we see in comics often has a real world counterpart. The artist is looking for something to model that representation on. And it may be stuff they have around their apartment. So we get a glimpse into their world, much as we do when we're looking at each other's Zoom backgrounds, right? There's a sense of seeing the artist's personal stuff put on display. And second, it might be something they found on the internet, which ties to those online communities that Will writes about, where they're tracking down, and in turn, readers track them back down. So I was fascinated by this website that listed all the furniture in Asterios Polyp and was very specific about designers and model numbers. So I have a paragraph there that I just cribbed that freely and put it in there just to break down the kinds of stuff that artist represented. And in some cases, they go out and collect the stuff. And I talk about the novel Museum of Innocence, where the artist tracked down in junk shops in Istanbul all the stuff he needed to tell his story and turned it into a physical museum in Istanbul that is a novel as a museum of stuff. So that sense of finding, making meaning, sketching meaning. So when we look at those images, when we often read past those backgrounds, but they're a conspicuous production process that the artist doesn't have to draw all that detail in. Economically, it makes a lot more sense not to draw all that detail in because you can generate more panels quickly. So they chose to draw that stuff in, and I can't help but think that's significant for understanding how the artist sees the world, what the artists think is important, just as the mattering maps and the stuff my students gathered helped us to see what the class thought was important.
I have a question about your mattering map that comes up with your from your discussion of stuff. Were you able not only to walk among and see these objects that mattered, but also touch them and interact with them tangibly?
In that art project, yes, you could. It was not a museum with rails. It was a classroom where you could physically engage with each other's stuff. A lot of the stuff was media, so everyone's favorite song is like playing at the same time in this room. It was a very imaginative project the student does. You don't remember most class projects, obviously, because we've got to dump things to acquire new ones, but this one has really stuck with me.
I want to try to make the discussion a little more tangible here. Henry, when I was reading your book, I really liked your analysis of the Yellow Kid and how swarming and mise-en-scène really informed your reading. Given that we're all coming at comics from very different disciplines, I was wondering if I could put up an image from the Yellow Kid and just kind of get your thoughts on how each one of you might read it visually. So pardon me for just a moment.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, I should go last since I've already written about this image. I'm curious what other people have to say. It stops popping around.
Sorry, yeah. Just trying to make it, it's one of those where like we need like a giant screen for this, right? We need a broadsheet monitor.
I mean, given how big, given how big the newspaper is at the turn of the century, where we really do. And it's been badly served in the past by shrunk down versions like the one in my book that don't allow us to really see the detail here. Well, if no one else wants to jump in, I will fill the silence. I mean, I think the first thing I see when I look at an image like this is just the chaos, which is your first impression, I think, when you look at it, that there's so much stuff going on at the same moment. And I think Altcult was very interested in the simultaneity of urban space. The sense that all kinds of people are living together, bumping up against each other. All these intersecting activities are taking place. And I think that's what his art tells us again and again when we look at it, is something new is emerging as America moves from the country to the city, and people from various immigrant populations are moving in and living side by side and not fully processing what's happening. And that's not a formal argument yet, but it's just an initial impression. And so I think to read this image, you really want to hover over it like a kid laying the newspaper out on the floor and crawling on top of it to look at the various images that are there to see who are these people? How are they clustered together? What's the dynamic relations between them? And in that case, I think Altcult uses the fireworks to create collisions between different spaces, between the foreground and the background, as these Roman candles go shooting out in all directions. And the calamities you start to notice, the guy falling off the balcony there, which is the kind of motif that Altcult comes in. There's always someone falling off of balconies in an Altcult cartoon, I think. And then the animals running through and running in terror from the fireworks is another thing that's almost always there. But the closer we look, you start to see, I haven't spent enough time with this one in particular, but you start to see a multiracial population, which is something that's interested me lately, looking at these cartoons more and more, that these are a group of kids from many races playing together, interacting with each other, compared to, say, the all-white world that Hank Ketchum creates in the Dennis the Menace cartoons that I flashed earlier, that by the 50s and 60s, comics are racially segregated, but they're not at this moment. And that detail, I think, matters to us.
Can I just ask, I mean, Henry or others, I mean, when I look at this, it seems to me that this is a picture trying to be noisy, and it's trying to be noisy because urban culture is marked by its cacophony of sounds. And it seems to me that's at least part. I mean, it's not just that you can see the marks of noises, but just the busyness, I think, is trying to be that. And I'm interested in this just because there's, you know, there are all these ideas of squawking and squawky movies as they arrive, and squawking public screeching radio become part of the vocabulary about 10 years later than this. Anyways, I just wonder if anybody else feels that this is trying to be noisy.
And maybe smoky too, with the fireworks going off, right? I think he's trying to capture the senses of the city in a lot of different ways. What this doesn't have, and a lot of Altcult does have, is a lot of signage, right? And that's the other thing that Altcult is obsessed with. They're putting signs everywhere, the visual clutter of the city. And if you look at photographs of the city of that era, that's very much the case of what's going on. I don't think Altcult could have achieved this with a panel breakdown, would be one of my points, right? That Altcult is often described in comics histories as primitive compared to the sophistication of, you know, subsequent comics. Winsor McCay in particular, who's seen as the father of modern comics because he turns it into a sequential art and focuses our attention and uses frames. I love Winsor McCay. I have original prints of Winsor McCay's work hanging in my office. So this is not a slam at McCay, but it is to say that Altcult is doing something different that we should pay attention to. And it has its own legacy in the splash page down the line, and the kind of busy splash pages of Jack Kirby or Harvey Kurtzman and Will Elder or some others, to me, are building on what Altcult did and keeping it alive in contemporary comics. So if we start with McLeod's definition of comics as sequential art, we can't say anything about this. This is not comics for McLeod. But to me, it's worth paying attention to because it's actually using the shape of the comics page, the full size of the newspaper, to do something that only comics could do in this way. Even though it owes something to Bruegel and some others that I reference in the book as well.
Can I
go ahead.
I just wanted to ask because when Henry said that this, you know, this maybe wouldn't work in terms of panels. It kind of reminds me of a page from Unflattening. It's my favorite page in Unflattening that has the Bodhisattva in it, and it's broken up into 9 panels, and it tells a story in each panel, but it also creates a full page image that is really beautiful, and the interplay between the reading it as a 9-page or a 9-panel page and reading it as a single panel page is really fascinating. And it makes me wonder how this would read differently if you just put panels over it. So if you thought about, you know, maybe the first panel is just the first 2 balconies, and then the second panel is the balcony and the ground, and then the last panel is just focused on the yellow boy, if that would make this whole thing read a little bit differently, which is to say that, like, to a degree, I think there is a sequential reading of this, and that because we read left to right and we tend to start at the top of the page, I feel like there is a sequentialness where you go down the side of the building and towards the center to the yellow boy at the focus, and then you kind of take the lens out for the wide shot, kind of. At least that's how it reads to me.
So Nick, what do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks, Joan. I have this sort of random story here. Teaching back when I was a postdoc at Calgary under Bart Beatty, who's somewhere on this conversation, with this large class, and this kid came to class with a T-shirt on that was a photo of something, but it was divided. It was as if you'd taken panel borders and cut it out. So it was just a photo of something, but it had, you know, it had missing pieces all the way through it. So it was like you were looking through a window frame, but you didn't actually see the frame. So that the negative space was still the T-shirt. And it prompted what I think turned into the entire class discussion. If all of a sudden putting those panels over it essentially turned his photo on his T-shirt into a comic book. You know, did all of a sudden that just that the act of setting this negative frame over it change what it was? And so I don't know. I'm trying to look at this page online right now to try to think about it. But I think it's a real question. I think you're right. You read this sequentially. I mean, there's something also very strange about this page, which is true of at least the first few years of Yellow Kid pages, where they're integrated into the regular text of the newspaper. It's not quite getting its own space yet. It sort of has to work with, I don't know how these were designed, if the page was designed first, or if here's what you get, make use of it. I don't know how that works, but I don't know. I mean, I think it's a really interesting thing, and it's interesting to think about this in terms of like Gasoline Alley pages where this technique is used all the time, where the grid is imposed over what is essentially a simultaneous scene. And so you have ways to read it that the grid imposes. I think it's like on one hand, the grid imposes reading, like it does that. But on the other hand, the ways the images and the ways text can be integrated in a single simultaneous image can also impose reading on it. So I think there's a lot of technique comics makers can use to impose reading flow, even without structure, which is something I tend to think about a lot.
So Joan, I was interested in your idea that reading top to bottom, left to right, which may be imposed by the practice published in a newspaper, but I'm not convinced that the first readers of comics would necessarily have approached it that way, given that's probably not how you would read a painting of the same subject matter, right? Maybe you could say something about that, Lisa.
I was going to say, I love this idea of doing the mental experiment of laying the grid over it. We in art history talk about the grid as a high modernist device that emphasizes the two-dimensionality of the picture plane and so forth. But the idea of laying these squares over a picture that is not necessarily organized by squares, which Nick does again so beautifully in Unflattening in that Bodhisattva page, sort of disciplines the image in a way. It asks you to read it in a particular way. And I think this might be the force of habits of reading languages that go left to right, top to bottom. When I looked at that picture just now, I was very keenly feeling sort of very different, because the first thing I looked at was its general orientation as a vertical this way and not a horizontal, which the intense expression of text that was at the upper right, the printed text, with the picture, as Nick was saying, underneath it. And I found that so beautiful because it's where you see most of the smoke and the hard to depict things, sort of evanescent aspects of the picture sort of floating away behind the text, which I thought was very lovely. The idea of how you get this text into a picture is something that has also really interested me as an art historian. Like, where does an inscription insert and impose itself on a pictorial scheme? But I loved your gesture, Henry, your interpretive gesture of bringing in the paintings by Bruegel, which are also similarly swarming things that are similarly thinking about humanity and their various antics, and the question of how we can see and interact with them. One thing that's really different from this page that just went up is they are huge. They are like 5 or 6 feet wide generally, including the one of the children's games, and they are horizontal. So they have a different presentation, I think, to the viewer. And since they have signs, they have symbols, and sometimes there are small words, but it's not as insistent as what I'm seeing in Yellow Boy. And I think the Yellow Boy at the bottom is sort of the culminating sort of punctuation mark to both the pictures and the text. Like, you might go all over the page, and if there is no grid, you are sort of left on your own devices to figure out where you're going. You're undirected, undisciplined, going where you might want to go, following any number of attractions within the field before you sort of plop down at the bottom on the figure of the main character, who is bigger, who is yellow, who so has a certain brightness. That's how I see this picture.
I teach this in class, and it always surprises me that my students are able to read Yellow Kid more easily than they are to read Watchmen. They get really stressed out at the number of panels on the Watchmen page, and they don't necessarily know where to start. Like, I almost have to teach them how to read comics. Whereas the Yellow Kid, they look at it, and because of their familiarity with things like Where's Waldo, they immediately start approaching it like it's a puzzle to be put together. And I see folks in the chat on the right-hand side are pointing out the kind of Easter eggs and meta-ness of it, right? Where the goat at the top is saying, tell him you saw me, and there's these kind of jokes. So the goat is almost always one of the first things they find, because they're used to scouring these really dense images for things like those Where's Waldo checklists. And so it always kind of amuses me how much that has informed their reading of visual imagery.
Well, I've been looking lately at Stan and Jan Berenstain, who did the Berenstain Bear books, but before that did pictures for Collier's and Saturday Evening Post. And they in their son's biography of their work, a portfolio of their work, cites Bruegel very explicitly for these full-page pictures they did in the 50s and early 60s of kids at the movie theater or kids at the toy store. And you'd have hundreds of kids doing all kinds of things clustered in various ways and intersecting each other. So it was still a very strong influence on comics quite late in, and very explicitly that connection back to Bruegel is an important one for them.
Before we turn to audience questions, I wanted to end, you guys have already kind of hit on the Stereos polyp imagery quite a bit, and I wanted to bring that up and talk a little bit about flippability. So I'm wondering if you would walk us through that concept a little bit, and I'll provide a little context. The images I'm showing come across the book at various different instances. They're not next to one another for the sake of comparison and contrast. So I'll bring that up in just a moment, but yeah, I'd love to hear more about flippability.
Yeah, I very much want to pull Nick into this part of the discussion, because that concept really came out of back and forth that he and I had on email at the time I was working on this chapter. But I was, I use in the book the Yellow Kid to talk about scannability, the degree to which we're taught in reading comics to scan the image and look at things in the background, which is very much different from reading across panels, which is what we often talk about. Here I was interested in the fact that these identical compositions are scattered across the book, And they are obviously tell a story over time of the history of this relationship. And each of these panels contributes to that picture. My analogy was to the breakfast scene in Citizen Kane, if that had been scattered across the entire film. But you could also, as you said, talk about Jeannie Dielman, you know, which has recurring spaces and compositions and so forth. So the flippability idea is that certain artists are very aware of the physicality of the book and build these things in, expecting that we will flip back and forth. Not easy to do on a book that doesn't have page numbers, by the way, but it's still, I think, something built in. So Nick, you spent a lot of time thinking about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you used this example as one of my favorites to share. You know, it makes the book such a rich reading to like keep, despite the lack of page numbers, to keep finding these connections and sort of stitches it together. And I think I taught a class for a first time this semester called Advanced Readings in Comics. And we read a lot of theory and a lot of comics and did a lot of diagramming of comics. And I think one of the things that I kept wanting to do, and even in something short, Alan Moore's and Melinda Gebbe's This Is Information, it's a 6-page comic written in a 9/11 tribute book. This idea that you could start to stitch together the ways within one page, like a certain image speaks to another image across that page, and then those motifs get repeated maybe throughout the thing. So you could, you know, in this sort of mad conspiracy theorist way, sort of lay out all the pages this way and start putting threads through them that link the book in a different way than the staples link the book. And I think, to me, I mean, it's something I think about maybe unconsciously in earlier works and certainly more consciously going forward. The way that you can have things that go unsaid and unremarked. I mean, in my own work on flattening, there's this symbol that shows up very early, and then it appears several times throughout the book, and it's never remarked upon. It's never even the subject of the story. But I assume that a reader who sees that, you know, starts to make connections in their head, and because they can flip, starts to go back and forth. And I think, you know, obviously things like Watchmen are a great example. You know, all the times you see the smiley face in different things, you're starting to have this other narrative going on that really, you know, I think I said this at the very start, like it's more than just putting pictures next to words or pictures next to pictures. You're creating a new kind of connectiveness by the way the pictures speak together across the entire work, the way they braid together, the way Grindstein would talk about it. I mean, I just think it adds this level of complexity that is hard to duplicate in other forms. Yeah.
I would like to add that I think this question of flippability is so interesting and so deeply tied to the format as a book, or what I would call the codex, which is the form of book that is bound on one side and has leaves that you can leaf through. I think that format is one that really teaches the reader, asks the reader to enjoy discontinuous reading, whereas the earlier format, or our current format returning, of scrolling prioritizes sequential, continuous, compliant reading. And I would love to hear from Nick and others, as comics move towards non-codex formats, non-book formats, are you going to encounter flippability differently then? And how exciting that will be. What will you be able to do? I guess that's a big question.
Well, I mean, it kind of gets at Scott McCloud's idea of the infinite canvas and using, you know, the digital spaces. You know, you can make a panel that's, you know, 900 feet long and explore that. And there's certainly been some folks who've done that with web comics. I still feel like people are so beholden to that old format of the page that even with things like Comixology and other apps, that I feel like that still hasn't kind of broken through quite to the extent that some folks may have wanted it to. But yeah.
I'm sure for some reason, part of my reason is certainly growing up with the kind of static comics that I had, and that's what I like. But I also think as a maker, that constraint of like, I've got to deal with this page and I've got to make it work and I've got to deal with this format and I've got to make it work. That added element of creative constraint, I think, is really generative for me.
It's like a sonnet.
It's like a what?
Sonnet.
Oh, yeah, you're right. And I also think that, this comes back to early in the conversation, that the static nature of comics is kind of the exciting nature of comics. Like, on one hand, we can say they're this flat, old, static medium, but on the other hand, we can say, well, that's what makes them so cool, because we can look at that yellow kid page and go back and forth and go back, and you can look at my 9-panel grid page that Joan mentioned earlier, and you can say, oh, there's connections here, and if you tried to do that on Comixology, nothing against Comixology, but you're moving in some direction that isn't necessarily the ways you want to discover things. And so, I find myself sort of curmudgeonly nervous about the sort of digital things. Not that you can't, I think you're just doing something very different. And there's nothing wrong with doing something very different, but I think it starts to move them into a very different, I don't want to say medium, or I don't know what the right word is, but it's a different way of doing things, dramatically different.
I think maybe the word you're looking for is like reading experience, but I just wanted to throw in, like, in my experience with Comixology, I think there's two kind of ways you can do Comixology. Is you can do their like panel by panel thing, which I really hate. It's clumsy and it doesn't do anything for the flow. And then you get the whole page at the same time sort of situation. But I think the thing about it partly is that most of the comics on Comixology are just scans, like sophisticated scans of printed comics, or just the digital file of the printed comics. So in a sense, the way things are on Comixology is because, well, they're just print things that have been digitized. But I also think that one of the advantages, I think, for Comixology is that I read stuff that I would never buy. So I read the entire Walking Dead series because I wanted to compare it to the show. And I was like, this is something that I personally don't have enough disposable income that I would go out and buy every single Walking Dead graphic novel, because Lord knows there's a lot. But, by Comixology, it's free, so I might as well. Well, not free, but I subscribe. So.
This is so fascinating to me because, I study new media, but from the deep past. And so I find that some of the things that you're saying, for instance, that you feel it's just scanning print, this idea that it's a new platform, but still deeply wedded to the previous platform, is something that I've seen a lot happening in the 15th and 16th century, where printed books are beginning to explode. And in the beginning, they really do look like they're trying to be manuscripts. And at a certain moment, they realize that they can do other things. And there's deep interconnections between those two. I'm so interested in those moments where you have both manuscript and print, and where all these things are like jostling with each other. And I feel like for comics, maybe we're hitting a moment where that's going to happen too, where the idea of what is a paper-born medium, what is a codex-born medium look like? How might we value it differently? How might we choose to do certain things with those aspects of the medium? Because it's no longer the default. It's no longer what you have to do or can do. When it's a choice, I want to use the grid. I want to read left to right and top to bottom. That makes something different than I have to. And I find those really exciting moments artistically and culturally. So I can't wait to see what's going to happen.
And I also feel like there's this moment of resistance too, where someone like Chris Ware does these digital comics like touch sensitive, which I don't know if you can get anymore. It was on the McSweeney's app for a long time, where he was using gestures that we would normally use for ebooks and undermining them. So the flip of the finger doesn't work and you have to tap pieces of the screen. But he's also somebody who's very much like, I'm going to make a book as an art object, and you don't want to buy this digitally. Rusty Brown won't work that way. You know, you have to read it in this one context where it reminds me kind of like vinyl, like what Jack White does with vinyl, where it's like, we are going to highlight what makes this medium very different and will not translate over to something digital. So yeah, it's weird to see these kind of fighting poles, if you will. Anyone else want to?
I think it also ties back to what Henry was saying about disposability and permanence. You know, it's this jostling that we're seeing. As something transfers, it might not just transfer completely, but we can see tensions between that, and that's what you're speaking to.
Right.
Well, you spend a lot of time thinking about these transitions and media and print culture. Do you have any reflections? We're not hearing you. You're on mute.
I mean, what I would want to know is how much the discussion about tactility and all of these things in digital comics is different from what's said about books, or, you know, obviously different about from what one says about vinyl and so on. What's the specific thing that makes the debate around comics different from other narratives or anxieties about digital mutation or migration or mutation? I mean,
Yeah,
are the questions the same? Is it, you know, the tactility,
I think having had Scott McCloud as a guest on my podcast recently where we talked about it, I think for him, there's an anxiety about the medium itself disappearing if you go fully into the digital realm, where the ability to juxtapose images together in a structured way gives way to a world of swipes and, you know, one panel at a time and so forth, that it ceases to be comics and becomes something else. And so I think Scott, who's an advocate for the, you know, expanded canvas, is deeply conservative when it comes to some of the other strategies by which comics get digitized. And I think my colleagues in literature department spend far less time than they should thinking about books as objects or text as something that's a printed artifact. They tend to abstract all that away and think about the text as a narrative or something else that's not material at all. So while there's anxieties about the loss of the book, I don't really think it's quite an anxiety about the medium of literature disappearing per se. I think it's a nostalgia for a delivery mechanism for them, whereas for Scott, the entire medium's at stake if you go to the comicsology model.
Can I ask a question that maybe would get us back to the question of value? So what's the relationship between the ongoing digitization of comics and the value of paper comics? Because you see in many fields where if everything's available online, the originals, paper or whatever material base they have lose value. On the other hand, that increases their scarcity to a certain extent and can enhance value. Are there any kind of obvious trends that Michael Thompson, for example, could help us understand, or his language could prove useful in understanding?
Well, I think about that question of value in two ways. There's economic value, which is, yes, I think the earliest comics continue to accrue economic value. Say the original Superman comic is still hugely valuable, despite the fact that that story's been reproduced countless times, and I can readily access it in digital form. That's not true for every comics, and there's a kind of glut on certain comics titles. Once the world caught up with the collectible value of comics, they devalue them by everyone holding on to them. So I won't say that it's across history, but certainly early comics become more valuable. And then there's the cultural value, which goes back, keep with the Dennis the Menace example I used earlier. I think there's, I'm seeing artistic arguments made about Hank Ketchum's style and the original Dennis the Menace dailies. They're right here in the introduction to this book. As it becomes hardbound and something you can put on a library shelf, there's a reappraisal of its cultural value taking place that says this is something that's worth reproducing, every one of them. This is only 2 years worth of the daily strips that this guy did. And so year by year, it's being reproduced and reappraised, and people are looking at it and critics are writing about it. So in that sense, the value has increased as it's gone hardbound. Digital only becomes a tool, I think, in that regard to whether it gains cultural value or not. I don't think the digital affects that nearly as much as being printed in a hardbound book does with the status that comes with that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any data on this, so I don't know, but I feel like there's definitely more interest in getting. I mean, I was thinking about Kevin Huizenga's River at Night, which was published last year, and you know, it had come out in installments, sort of almost brochure kind of installments over the last decade or so, and but the hardback edition of it is this. It's this really stunning designed book jacket, and I mean everything about, like, it's got raised stuff on it, like everything about the print edition, it makes you want to own the print edition. And I feel like they're doing a lot more to make you care to own the print edition, even though you can get the digital. You know, Joan can read them all on Comixology, but then the stuff you really like is going to be in this much nicer format that you can appreciate. I mean, it feels like, I mean, maybe that's a shift in books in general. I don't know.
I also think there's something to be said for the journey of tracking something down. Like, I remember when I was an undergrad, before everything was streaming, if I found some out of print Antonioni movie at the local library, I prioritized watching it. And that was something I made room in my schedule for. But now that I have the Criterion channel with all of this stuff, it's really difficult for me to prioritize what I want to pay attention to and what I want to make room for in my schedule. So even though it's all there, there's this kind of paradox of abundance where it's just like, it's too hard to make a decision when, you know, there's 2,000 channels and, you know, you can't really make a choice.
Well, to get to where we're going to talk about next week, Seth, as an artist, is really interested in the chance discovery, that you go to a flea market and you find something you didn't expect to find. And he's very nostalgic for that. Whereas Kim Deitch in his books really loves the systematic search capacity of the internet and the ability to go down a rabbit hole and connect one thing to the next, And it's very interesting to look at those two artists side by side and the ways in which they think about how we create a pursuit of something we're interested in the digital era.
Yeah, when I stopped collecting vinyl records, I didn't know what to do when I visited new cities, because that organized my itineraries through the cities. Now I go to flea markets and look for old paper, but that's, you know, and it's partly just the collecting provides the template of the movements I make through the city, and I would miss that even if I lost interest in paper.
I want to turn, we have a couple questions, one that very much overlaps with what we just talked about from Maria, but I'm going to prioritize two from Joan Miller. The first question is, would it make more sense to think of the definition of comics on a scale of less comicsy to more comicsy? She said in Henry's class that they discussed everything from hieroglyphics to signage, and that she thought maybe a classification system akin to something like the Kinsey scale might be more useful.
Yeah, I guess the question is, does the Kinsey scale for comics create limits or borders beyond which it ceases to be a comic? And some artists, I guess, will be drawn to those borders, and some we will not look at because they step outside those borders. Maybe we're looking for queer comics. Maybe we're looking for straight comics. I don't know, but I think that question's a really interesting one.
It always, well, when I'm in class, I ask this question of what can comics be, and we get into the discussion about IKEA instructions over, you know, because essentially you're stripping the text out, but it's still the schematic that you have to read in a very specific order in order to get the narrative of how to put together your coffee table, right?
And Lego instructions.
Yeah,
and I think we can see that stuff as a legacy of someone like Will Eisner doing instructional manuals for the military during World War II, where there was just a sense that that was the most basic language you could use, a combination of words and pictures to communicate that information. So there's the key instructions have a long legacy, I think we could trace through comics history.
I wonder
The
if I could
second
ask.
question.
Oh,
Go ahead.
sorry. No, I was just one of the things that sticks to me when I was reading Henry's book was when he admits that he's a pack rat. And, and I'm kind of like, I don't collect either, but I feel like I collect. Like, you can't see the room where I'm in now, but there's long boxes all over the place. I need to move because, well, I used to sell things. Me and Drew were talking about it last night. You sell things and you downgrade. I'm not selling things anymore. I've got rid of all of my good stuff. So now I just want to move, and I just wanted to ask, I mean, I'm sure some of the other panelists might have some thoughts about this. So when you moved from MIT, Henry, I'm just thinking, that was a big job for some removal person, right?
Oh yeah, and it cost USC a lot of money to acquire my collection.
Really? So are you the same? You don't throw anything away?
Well, I won't say I don't throw anything away. I'm not a hoarder, right? And a hoarder is someone who maps parts of their identity onto everything they touch. So that I'm not quite that bad yet.
No.
But I collect lots of different things, which means there's a certain amount of clutter in my environment. And something that this book is partially about owning. The clutter.
A lot of the people a lot of the comics readers I talk about in the area and stuff, there's always this conversation that it says, well, I've had to move my comics into the attic, or I've had to create something to hide them from view because my wife doesn't like them. And I'm aware of the gendered nature of those complaints, but it's like comics are something that we need to hide. We put them away. There's still that kind of, well, to be honest, I think it's because long boxes are not exactly the most aesthetic looking things, are they? These cardboard. No one's come up with a great solution to storing comics yet.
Well, in my study, which I'm not doing this from the study, I decided to do the book drop, but it's a long tunnel at this point with DVDs along one wall and comics along the other with my desk in the middle.
Right.
Which says something about how I live in relation to media. But comics I put on bookshelves. I'm unafraid to put them out in the open in that way. And yes, there are certain challenges with the floppies. You put them in plastic folders clustered together based on topics and, titles and so forth. But, the challenge is how to organize comics, because as I deeper and deeper in comics, the relationship between different artists shifts in my mind, and I'm constantly having to reshelf things to think about, should I put Gasoline Alley next to Chris Ware? Well, probably. Yeah. But, on the other hand, if you were doing a history of comics, it would not make a lot of sense to structure them that way.
Yeah, we just had a couple of comments from Joan and Nick. Nick says that his comics are in his parents' barn in rural Michigan, not for hiding, but for moving in no space. And Joan has her floppies in a filing cabinet set up like at a comic store. That's really fascinating about how people store these things. Oh, and Sarah said there's a parallel in the knitting community. Mostly female knitters talk about having to hide their yarn from their husbands. So there's definitely a gendered aspect as to, because my partner says, why are you always talking about continuity and mistakes? He says, we women don't care about that. We just want to read good stories. So, and I've often wondered, is continuity, and I'm talking about superhero comics, of course. And I remember one conversation we had a few years ago, Henry, when you were in Sunderland, which is when I said, Jesus, it's really expensive keeping up with this. And you said, yeah, it is expensive if you do it right. That was a good, I spend too much money on comics, probably.
Well, that's a part of the materiality we haven't totally touched on yet, right? The materialism of comics as opposed to the materiality of comics. But it's all about how do these things shift in value, going back to the rubbish theory idea. How do we decide what's worth spending that much money for, or how do we decide what's worth giving the space over to, given, say, we live in studio apartments, and it's all going to be on display if you hold on to it.
Yeah. I mean, because I've been writing chapters around reboots in the 60s and stuff, I bought some Silver Age comics that were probably what you were reading when you were a kid. your favourites. One of them was a Batman one under the Julius Schwartz era. And the first thing I did was I lifted it up, I touched it, stroked it. I didn't know this, my partner watched. I stroked it, opened the pages, and then I sniffed.
Yep. The smell.
There's Drew's nodding his head there, yeah?
Yeah.
Smell of
I
writing
know
paper.
it's
It's quite fetishistic, isn't it, in a sense?
Not in a sense, just straightforward fetishistic.
Yeah.
There's another question from Joan that I think is really interesting. I wonder how much anyone has thought about the way theater history has influenced the sort of mise-en-scène of the frame, given that so much of the work we looked at reminded her of Renaissance era human tableaus. And for my own work on early comic strips, I think if you're interested in this topic, Joan, I would really recommend Don Crofton's early works on Emile Cole and Before Mickey, because Don does a great job of kind of teasing out the different traditions in early animation and comics to a certain extent. He dismisses the influence a little too much, but there is this kind of weird moment where these different art forms are all kind of in this gumbo together and kind of taking aesthetic cues from one another in early cinema. So you might want to check that out. But I don't know if anyone else in the conversation has any thoughts on that topic. Maybe Lisa.
Can you say the name again?
Don Crofton, Crafton.
Yep. Greg Smith also has a really good piece on Will Eisner's framing and the Yiddish theater movements that he talks about growing up, particularly in some of his Jewish shtetl kinds of stories. So that's in a book on comics in the city. I can't quite remember the editors of it, but we can probably track it down.
I would say, I think that's a great question. I love the idea of thinking about the spaces as settings in particular. And there's a lot of discussion now between in art history about talking about ground and figure, background and foreground and so forth. And my virtual background is a bit of a joke, but not really. I mean, I really thought about it sort of carefully because it's Raphael's School of Athens, which is where there's a whole bunch of people together talking from all over, all different times, all different places, all talking civilly and debating about the nature of truth and other important questions. I see it as a framing for me, right? And also a framing for me as I'm here alone, but sort of also with you and sort of with the philosophers who aren't pictured here. So I think the question of how we're going to frame ourselves is, as we think of encountering comics, is something to think about as well. In terms of settings, I think in unflattening Piranesi's great Carcery images, his prints of the so-called prisons, which are these amazing views down into this deep and open space. I think it's interesting to note that Piranesi was trained as a stage designer and a set designer, and this is how he provided much of his own income. And the question of how to frame pictures in general is something also that has been of great interest to art historians, thinking about what it means to be a picture, what it means to be a picture, aware that you're a picture. The meta painting that Victor Strykita talks about is all about pictures that have edges, pictures that fetishize openings or holes or nets or things that you look into as a way of the painting declaring itself as a made picture. So I think that might be a sort of further afield, but another way to enrich your thinking.
Throw in a little bit more of the art history aspect. I feel like in Henry's class, we maybe also talked about, I think it's Rodin's Doors, that is like the gates of hell. Yeah. And then also we talked about the Stations of the Cross, because I was raised Catholic. So the Stations of the Cross are the story of the crucifixion. And in order to get the whole story, you have to walk around the entire church. And so to me, it's interesting to think about those forms as sequential art as well.
No, I think that's really true. I'm really also interested in ritual practice, which often involves processions and walking around and looking at things. And so the sequentiality of movement through space is one of the things that I'm really, really interested in. And I think thinking about the Stations of the Cross is an interesting way also because it signals within the space of a particular local church, a sort of universal everywhere for that particular belief community, each meditating on a particular scene that is pictured in that particular space in a particular sequence. And this makes me also think about your question of flippability, the issue of flippability and going back and forth. You move, but then you arrive and you ponder, you contemplate, you pray, and then you move again. And the question of flippability, where you hit these settings that are repeated but different, is something that I see very akin to this type of processional motion. And even to the extent of thinking about things like milestones. What are milestones? Milestones in the Roman era are things where they're marking your distance from Rome, and they look the same, right? They're a certain height, they're a certain whatever, and it might or might not say, you know, something, but what it says and what it looks like is familiar because it's the next one. So it's this idea, again, of sequentiality built into a repetition of forms that is always the same and yet always different. It's the next one, or it's the previous one if you've gone backwards. So I think thinking about motion and the beholder in motion is something that I'm particularly interested in too. I'm trying to learn more, not just from comics, but also from cinema, because I'm thinking about time and space and motion. And I would be interested in hearing others' thoughts on those sorts of issues too. If anyone has.
Lots of thoughts.
I'll say that as we were talking in the chat, Nick came and he mentioned earlier that Christopher Couch talks about comics and vaudeville. Is there anything you want to say about that, Nick?
No, I mean, I think his art, I saw the talk and I think there's some chapters on it. And I couldn't track them down, and I lose track of things when I'm tracking things and listening to the conversation. But I think, you know, looking at sort of the timing of vaudeville and looking at things like Popeye comics, and I think it relates to that earlier question. And I posted a link to a talk he gave, and I couldn't find the chapter, but I think
well, and so many vaudeville performers were lightning sketch artists, right? Folks like McKay and how am I forgetting famous faces of the tongue twister animated title. But yeah, like so many of those guys were doing newspaper comics and on vaudeville that it's kind of hard to say that there wasn't this weird overlap in their early aesthetics of, you know, performance and the foregrounding of like the artist's hand and things like that in early animation.
Or we could go back to the frontality of the yellow kid in the picture we looked at earlier, looking directly to the audience and addressing them as very much a device of vaudeville performances. And the book, I connect that via Tom Gunning and Cinema of Attractions and so forth. But Gunning, you know, and it would go back to the Fairground Barker, but in between the Fairground Barker and the comic strip would have been the vaudeville performer stepping out in front of the curtain or backdrop and directly addressing the audience. So, and the gag structure of early comics, certain of them are based on the kind of fragmented style of slapstick and new humor that was very much in the air in the vaudeville era. After all, my very first book was on vaudeville and early sound comedy, so I know something of the way those performance traditions impact each other. You know, and we may get to a little of that when we talk to next week about Alice in Sunderland, which uses music hall as one of its kind of core metaphors for thinking about how it's organizing time and space.
Any last final questions for our panel?
I feel like you mentioned one by Mary, I think, that we didn't get to.
Billy had sent me one. Where was it? I can't find it right now. The question was from Maria, and it was about disposability and materialism that we had gotten at the same time we were having the discussion about digital comics and materialism. So I kind of felt like we had kind of tackled it already. If somebody else wants to dive back in on that one, or if Maria's still in chat and you want to follow up on that, we're happy to answer it.
I will say that I've been talking in the chat with a lot of people here. Thanks, guys. Yeah, really, really interesting stuff here. But if there's any books that's been mentioned or any recommendations, I'll pull them out. And when we put this on the blog, I'll make sure that we have that as well. Because nothing more that I like than recommendations and all of that. Although it does hurt my wallet. But it is expensive if you do it right.
This is true.
Well, I haven't read Asterios Polyp, if that's how you pronounce it, and Nick and Joan got me to just jump online and pay almost £30 for it. They sang its praises so much that I just couldn't refuse any longer.
It's worth it. It's really good.
It's definitely an important work.
Yeah.
Well, considering we don't have any more questions, we'll tie it up for the day, but thank you all for participating today, and be sure to RSVP for the next couple sessions that we're going to have, I believe, on the next following Tuesday. So we're moving from Wednesday to Tuesday. Let me bring up my phone and I'll get you dates.
It was a little bit of a dodge to get all the speakers in. We couldn't do it all on the same day, but it definitely is the next 2 Tuesdays.
Yeah, so Tuesday the 23rd and Tuesday the 30th, and you can find more information on the individual topics and speakers on Henry's blog. Anything else I'm forgetting, Henry or Amanda, that you can think of bookkeeping-wise that I need to let people know about?
I don't think so.
Okay.
If I can say finally, just one more thing is, I know you and me were talking about it last night, Drew, thinking that this was a great idea, and if we wanted to continue having a virtual book club once a month where, let's say it's Drew who says, right, let's read this comic, we all read it. And I know Joan's expressed some interest, and maybe that will be something that we can take forward in the future.
Yeah, I think we're inventing new forms of sociality day by day as we go through the pandemic. But
Yeah.
This is something I'm seeing emerge. SCMS is doing a bunch of these now. Some other professional organizations are doing it. So I think I would love to see it continue.
Yeah.
It's been fun.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's been really interesting.
Yes, thanks
so
to
much,
all of my
everybody.
thinking partners. It's been great to have you all here. So
Thanks for
Thanks
having
for populating my empty room.
me. I have little
Take
email.
care, everybody.